The office was quiet, but the tension felt like it could crush the room. Clint Eastwood, barely 25, stood there listening as the studio executive, a man whose opinion could shape or destroy careers, leveled his judgment with surgical precision. Every word cut into the moment like a scalpel, yet Clint's face revealed nothing. Why does a single person wield so much power over someone else's dream? Why do their opinions carry the weight of destiny? The executive leaned back, his authority absolute, outlining why Clint's look, height, and voice supposedly made him unsuitable for the silver screen. He didn't just reject a performer, he dismissed potential, identity, and ambition all at once. Around them, a handful of assistants and observers felt the gravity of the moment. Everyone sensed the stakes. This wasn't just another meeting. It was a crossroads that could define a lifetime. And yet, in that stillness, Clint's mind was alive with quiet calculation. He absorbed the criticism without flinching, measuring it against a deeper certainty that the executive's verdict was not the final word. What would happen next? Would ambition bend under judgment, or could resilience transform rejection into something far greater? This was the beginning of an extraordinary story, born in silence, charged with unspoken resolve, and destined to shock everyone who underestimated him. In the 1950s, Hollywood was a world defined as much by appearance as talent, and every detail of an actor's presence could tip the scales between stardom and obscurity. Studio executives, like the one Clint Eastwood faced, were convinced that certain physical traits were insurmountable barriers. Height, voice, and even subtle nuances of facial structure were scrutinized as if they contained a hidden verdict on an actor's destiny. Why would a towering frame be considered a liability? In an era when leading men were expected to convey approachability and charm, a 6'4" figure seemed intimidating, even alien to casting directors who feared audiences would reject anything outside their familiar ideal. And the voice, quiet and raspy, was judged as lacking authority or charisma. Yet those very qualities, understated and authentic, later became his signature. The executive's authority carried weight because he represented decades of industry experience and gatekeeping power. Every decision he made reinforced a rigid hierarchy, convincing young actors that only certain molds could succeed. This judgment was not just business, it was a moral framework imposed on dreams, and the fear of rejection was palpable. We can relate to that pressure, how it feels to be told implicitly or explicitly that something intrinsic about ourselves makes us unworthy of success. Yet the very traits that were considered flaws were in reality untapped assets. Clint's height, voice, and presence were misunderstood because perception often disguises potential. What seems like a limitation to one observer can be transformative in the hands of someone willing to redefine standards. This tension between imposed expectation and hidden possibility created the perfect stage for a story of vindication. By understanding why the executive believed these traits would end Clint's career, we can appreciate the audacity of what he would later accomplish. It was not defiance for its own sake, but a quiet insistence on reframing perception, proving that success is not measured by conformity, but by the courage to harness one's unique presence. Every dismissive word, every critical glance became fuel for a journey that would rewrite the rules of Hollywood, showing that the qualities once deemed liabilities could become the very elements that defined a legend. In hindsight, the fear of failure, the weight of judgment, and the imposed limitations were not obstacles, they were catalysts, forcing him to internalize resilience, sharpen his instincts, and ultimately demonstrate that the industry's rigid standards were not laws, but illusions to be transcended. How could someone take the traits that were meant to destroy them and turn them into the tools of extraordinary success? Clint's answer would not be immediate, but it would be undeniable, shaping an era and inspiring anyone who has ever been told they don't fit the mold. Clint Eastwood sat across from the executive, absorbing every word, yet revealing nothing. To an observer, he was quiet, almost fragile, but beneath that calm exterior, a storm was quietly gathering. How often have we been in a situation where someone in power dismisses us, where their judgment feels final and all you can do is remain still? That stillness is deceptive. In those moments, silence becomes a shield, a way to measure, process, and prepare. Every critique, every condescending glance was cataloged in his mind, not as humiliation, but as data, a roadmap for understanding exactly what the world expected of him, and, more importantly, what he intended to defy. We relate to this on a personal level, how it feels to be underestimated, how the weight of someone else's opinion can press on your chest yet not break you. The tension in the room was palpable. Colleagues, assistants, and other executives were watching, unsure if this quiet man would crumble or retaliate. That uncertainty amplified the stakes, turning a simple firing into a silent psychological battlefield. Clint's face gave nothing away, but his jaw tightened slightly, a subtle sign that every insult, every dismissal was landing and being repurposed into determination. He was learning to wield restraint as a weapon, to let others underestimate him while he quietly strategized his next move. How often do we forget the power of calm in the face of adversity, the way composure can magnify influence far beyond any loud protest? Each word the executive spoke meant to crush confidence, instead cemented an internal promise: he would prove them wrong. That promise, forged in silence, carries a unique intensity because it is private, personal, and untouchable by external forces. We've all felt the sting of rejection, but not all of us have felt the clarity that comes when that rejection ignites a sense of purpose. Clint's silence spoke volumes, louder than any argument or protest could have. It demonstrated control, focus, and the quiet audacity to internalize criticism and transform it into future power. Viewers can't help but wonder, in the tense minutes of that confrontation, what was going through his mind? What action would follow this quiet resilience? The open loop lingers because silence itself creates suspense. By not reacting outwardly, Clint became both invisible and omnipresent, a paradox of restraint that compels attention. The room was filled with noise, yet it was his silence that resonated, a lesson for anyone who has ever faced dismissal or doubt. Sometimes the most powerful reaction is measured thought, self-possession, and the unwavering conviction that what others deem a flaw can be your defining strength. Every eye in that office was fixed on him, but no one could predict the quiet storm building beneath his calm, a storm that would one day redefine the very standards they thought he failed to meet. Clint Eastwood walked out of that office carrying more than a simple rejection. He carried the weight of judgment that could have broken most young men. But what makes some people rise while others crumble? Was it stubborn pride, blind ambition, or a quiet certainty that the world had simply misread him? In that moment, Clint made a conscious decision. He would not let someone else's perception define his reality. He understood that talent alone was not enough. Success demanded persistence, discipline, and a willingness to endure setbacks that could feel endless. What choice did he have but to take control of his narrative, to prove not just the executive wrong, but to prove to himself what he was capable of achieving? Each rejection became a stepping stone, every small role a classroom for learning. Working odd jobs by day, he returned to auditions and acting classes with a new lens, seeing every critique as a guide, every minor success as evidence that he could shape his own destiny. How often do we undervalue the slow, invisible work that precedes visible triumph, mistaking it for insignificance? Clint's strategy was methodical. He studied his craft relentlessly, not to satisfy a critic, but to cultivate an identity that no one could undermine. This quiet, deliberate focus built resilience, a power invisible to those who only see immediate results. Along the way, small victories accumulated, an audition he didn't think he could get, a fleeting moment on screen that caught a director's eye, a subtle mastery of his own presence and voice. Each of these moments reinforced an internal truth. He was shaping his future through consistent action, not through the validation of others. Aspiration requires more than wishing. It requires choosing to act in spite of doubt, to carve opportunity from apparent impossibility. The executive who dismissed him held authority in that room, but outside it, that authority had no power over the decisions Clint would make, the paths he would follow. In shifting focus from external judgment to internal commitment, Clint reversed the power dynamic. The world could doubt him, but he would not doubt himself. He became his own gatekeeper, his own measure of worth, proving that agency over one's destiny begins with a single choice: to refuse defeat, to act deliberately, to persist where others give up. What can we learn from this? That the slow accumulation of effort, the quiet cultivation of skill, and the unwavering resolve to act on your vision can overturn the harshest judgments. Clint Eastwood's decision to persist wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, it was quiet, methodical, and relentless, a blueprint for anyone who has ever been underestimated. He transformed rejection into fuel, and in doing so, he set the stage for the eventual reversal of power, the moment when the doubters would witness to their astonishment the full measure of what they had dismissed. Clint Eastwood's early years after leaving Universal were a study in quiet perseverance. He didn't have a map, he didn't have guarantees, and yet he treated every small role as a masterclass in understanding his craft. Each bit part, no matter how insignificant it seemed to others, became an opportunity to observe, learn, and refine. Have you ever considered how much growth comes from moments that seem invisible to the world? While others chased fame, Clint focused on mastery, on discovering the nuances of presence, timing, and the subtle power of a glance or a pause. He worked odd jobs, digging pools, pumping gas, tasks that might have humbled someone else, but instead they reinforced a discipline that no studio could teach. It's remarkable how often the very experiences we underestimate become the foundation of resilience. And as he moved between auditions, classes, and these day jobs, he began to understand something profound. The traits that had been dismissed as flaws, the tall frame, the raspy voice, the quiet intensity, could be molded into defining strengths. How many of us have felt limited by the very things that could set us apart if approached with insight and intention? Clint experimented, practiced, and, crucially, observed. He watched other actors, not to imitate, but to identify what worked and why. He learned that presence is less about volume or size and more about the confidence and conviction behind every gesture, every word. Slowly, the boy who had been told he would never make it in Hollywood began to sculpt an identity that no one could ignore. Every minor success, every small acknowledgement became a brick in a foundation of self-assurance. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't immediate, and yet it was unstoppable. The contrast is striking. What the executive had seen as weaknesses became tools of magnetism, the very qualities that would later command attention and respect on screens around the world. Can you imagine the patience it takes to persist without instant validation, to trust in an unseen trajectory, and to refine skills day after day without applause? That is the essence of mastery. And with each passing role, Clint's confidence grew, not as arrogance, but as quiet authority. He was building something far more powerful than a career. He was shaping a legacy. Every early lesson, every moment of deliberate practice served as a rehearsal for the larger stage that awaited. By the time the world noticed him, he was not only ready, he was inevitable. The audience, the directors, the critics, all of them would soon witness the transformation of what had been called flaws into an icon's signature.
And behind that transformation was a choice to commit, to learn, and to allow every challenge to serve as a stepping stone rather than a barrier. In understanding Clint's journey, we see that greatness is rarely sudden. It is the accumulation of small wins, the quiet attention to craft, and the courage to turn perceived weaknesses into unparalleled strengths. After years of quiet labor, countless auditions, and small, almost invisible roles, the moment finally arrived when Hollywood could no longer overlook Clint Eastwood. It began with a role that at first glance seemed modest, almost unremarkable, yet it carried the weight of opportunity. Have you ever noticed how life often presents the smallest doors just before the biggest breakthroughs? Clint was cast in a television series, a Western that would run for several seasons, and it was here that the first whispers of recognition began. Critics who had ignored him now remarked on the unusual presence he brought to the screen, the way he seemed to command attention without raising his voice or exaggerating his gestures. This was a man who had been told his height was a liability, that his quiet voice lacked impact, and yet audiences were drawn to him naturally, instinctively, without effort. Could the executive who had dismissed him have imagined that these very traits, the tall frame, the understated tone, the slow, deliberate intensity, would become his signature, the very qualities that made him unforgettable? Word of his performance spread through the industry, carried by directors, casting agents, and colleagues who began to recognize a talent that had been invisible only because they had looked for the wrong markers. Hollywood, with its rigid definitions of stardom, was being forced to acknowledge that they had misjudged what makes a leading man. Each positive review, each fan reaction, each nod from insiders added momentum, validating years of patience and persistence. It was not an overnight success. The transition from obscurity to attention was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, yet unstoppable once it began. Clint's presence on screen carried an authority that no script or camera angle could manufacture, a quiet power that slowly silenced the doubts that had been embedded in every rejection letter and harsh critique. The suspense of his career, once uncertain, transformed into a narrative of inevitability. If talent and determination are given time and focus, they cannot remain hidden forever. And yet, how often do we ignore the slow, steady accumulation of effort, expecting validation to arrive instantly? Hollywood had to notice because the evidence was undeniable. What had been dismissed as flaws, the height, the voice, the calm intensity, were now the very things that set him apart. The first signs of this recognition were more than just personal triumphs. They were social proof, a public acknowledgement that the gatekeeper's judgment had been incomplete, perhaps even wrong. It was a turning point not only for Clint, but for the industry itself, a subtle yet profound lesson in looking beyond superficial expectations and recognizing true potential. In that moment, the trajectory of his career shifted, and the narrative that had been written by critics and executives began to unravel. Audiences were captivated, Hollywood peers were intrigued, and Clint Eastwood's story became proof that persistence, careful observation, and self-belief could overturn years of doubt, turning rejection into the first chapter of legendary success. The world was watching, and finally, he could not be ignored.
This is the kind of victory that endures because it is rooted in personal growth and ethical strength. How might you apply this lesson to your own life? Which doubts, whether from others or yourself, are holding back potential that only persistence can unlock? The satisfaction comes not from proving someone wrong, but from proving to yourself that dedication, patience, and belief in your own abilities create outcomes no moment of rejection can erase. Sharing this story is more than recounting Hollywood history. It is a reminder to everyone striving, doubting, or hesitating that their journey is theirs to command. Clint's example is a beacon. Talent is fleeting, but character, perseverance, and self-belief build a legacy that no criticism can diminish.
Ask yourself, as he did through his own actions, how will you respond when confronted with doubt? Will you falter, or will you turn rejection into motivation, shaping a path that future generations can look at and say, that is the mark of someone who knew their worth and refused to compromise? Let that reflection guide your choices and recognize that every small, deliberate action compounds into a career and a life worth remembering.